Welcome to our finale in what has been a community series on AI at work. I'm Lexi Reese. I'm the co-founder with Steve Herod. Where's Steve? Steve of Lanai. We have a very small team. Raise your hand, loud and proud, if you are a Lanai employee. We don't have a cute name yet. I want to thank everybody here for this event. Is not possible without all of them. I also want to thank ColorWave. Raise your hand if you're from ColorWave. So ColorWave and Ricardo and Jose, who are doing an externship at Lanai. And if you are a Lanai investor, raise your hand. Anyway, welcome to the community event. Lanai is an AI empowerment platform for large workplaces. We help enterprises unify visibility, protection, and production of AI. And specifically, we're about the intent of AI is not cool tech. It's to empower extraordinary things that weren't possible before. And if we develop this technology over the next 20 years, the same way we've developed the internet over the last 20 years, I think we can probably in this room understand what the implications are going to be for people, planet, and democracy. So the intention of Lanai is to help workplaces do what they all want to do at every level, which is navigate this next transition by seeing clearly what's going on, by acting wisely with better data, and by empowering everyone at every level of the organization to do things they couldn't before. So the purpose of this series is sort of to mirror our software, which is lower the barrier to entry to democratize the trends and the meaning of certain things in AI so that you can go back to whatever corner of the universe it is that you came from and use some of that understanding from thought leaders like Nicole and George, who I'll now introduce, to code better, to think differently, to design workplaces and cultures that empower people to feel like they are capable of doing something really special. ColorWave is a partner that helps us to make sure that the teams that we're building here, and I hope you'll talk to John about your own teams, represent the people this technology has to serve. So we're not persisting biases that are so definitively existent in a lot of the data from which these large language models are being developed. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce the two people who 125 of you signed up to hear from. So first, Nicole Perlroth. Perlroth? Yeah? I've never said it out loud, so now, yeah.
A lot of
I mean, just badass. Former cybersecurity reporter for the New York Times. She is the best-selling author of something that you probably read to your kids at Christmas. This is how they tell me the world ends. Now an advisor for CISA and a managing partner at Silver Buckshot Ventures. I like that you said you're betting on heroes or something?
Betting on heroes.
Betting on heroes and heroines. George Mathew is a managing director at Insight Partners, which is not an investor yet. This is like a trial round. This is a new kind of like VC pitch. He has super background in both enterprise software development, operating, and now investing. He was CEO of Kespri and president and COO of Alteryx, and now serves on a bunch of AI boards. So let's get into it. Okay, Nicole, what happened in Hezbollah?
Thank you, Lexi. I was just reminiscing with Lexi the first time and last time I saw Lexi, she was about to head to the debate against Adam Schiff when she was running for office. And I just want to say it's really cool that you did that. I know you're not there, but we all bitch all the time about politics. It's really cool to know someone who actually tried to go do something about it. So I just want to put that out there.
Oh, thank you. Cool.
Yeah, seriously. Okay, what happened in Lebanon? So this is like the ultimate supply chain attack. It's not a cyber attack, we think. George did a much closer read of the reporting than I have done, but basically, when you use a certain technology to communicate with other terrorists, and that technology is not used by people really beyond your terrorist network, you become perfect bullseye target for what happened yesterday, which was, I think they're calling it Operation Below the Belt. It started with a Hungarian front company. I'm going to let George tell this story because he did a much closer read of the reporting today. It would have been me that would have had to report on this at the New York Times, but now that I'm outside of the New York Times, I get to let other people read it back to me.
So yeah, it was fascinating to see this. And by the way, Insight does a fair amount of investing, particularly in Israel. We're today about $10 billion long in assets, particularly coming out of Israel from just that region alone, and just what's been happening has been just a challenge for anyone who's on any side of that conversation. But in particular, this, call it long game that was played, and there's no sort of official responsibility being sort of at least said on who did it and how. But the work that played out was that the pager company that was looking to distribute their pagers, particularly in the Middle East and in Europe, ended up doing business with a shell company that was set up particularly for the purpose of distributing these pagers that were then changed. And one of the big changes that were in the pager as they were being distributed was a little piece of explosive was added to the pager itself near the battery that could be then detonated. And so this was truly just a long game, right? And we've seen these before, particularly in that region where these long games are being played. And I guess there was some possibility that this information had leaked, that the discovery of these explosives that were built into the pagers was about to be revealed, and a number of other tensions were happening in the region, and it just seemed like a moment to, unleash the pagers. So, and then the walkie-talkies after that, right?
So Nicole, you said it wasn't cyber, but there is a cyber arms race going, and you've reported a lot about this. How do you think AI and Gen AI in particular impacts that arms race? And maybe paint the picture of what that is, because I think even cybersecurity, we might need to go from the general to the specific.
Okay, so first, kind of the good news. We've been talking a lot in cybersecurity for the past year and a half about something called the Volt Typhoon attack. So Volt Typhoon is this one particular Chinese actor who has been attacking U.S. infrastructure. They've done it for the last decade, but the U.S. just started declassifying a lot of these attacks over the last 2 years, let's call it. And they're getting more aggressive, and they're getting into things like our water utilities, oil and gas pipelines, scary stuff. And there's many different theories about why they're doing it. Probably the most generous is that we are now in this new era of mutually assured digital destruction. We're likely in their business, they're in ours, we're in Russia's. I've reported those stories. Russia's definitely in ours. I've reported those stories. We've been classifying a lot of more information about sort of the extent of what Russia's gotten into our infrastructure as well. But the worrying thing is that these Volt Typhoon attacks in particular are very hard to catch because we call them living off the land attacks. They don't happen. It's not the old, phishing, deploy malware, hopefully you catch it 6 months later. It's they log in. They log in and they're acting like an administrator, and they're not doing anything that would be out of the ordinary until one day they might need to detonate on that access. And the other theories I didn't cover are, maybe if they were going to take some action on Taiwan, well, what political appetite would Americans have to support Taiwan if suddenly we couldn't get access to clean water or gas? We all saw what happened after the Colonial Pipeline attack. By the way, I was reporting on that attack, and I broke a lot of the information around that attack at the New York Times. One of the things that always stuck with me was there was a confidential Department of Energy assessment that said, as a country, the U.S. could have only afforded 2 more days of downtime. And it wasn't so much the oil and gas or jet fuel, it was the diesel required to run our factories. So we are very, very vulnerable. So imagine a Colonial Pipeline times 5 even, what that would do to the economy, et cetera. So this is the reality of what's happening, and it's been very hard to catch these attacks. One, maybe the only piece of good news I heard come out of RSA this year was that Rob Joyce, who until recently was sort of the nation's top hacker at the NSA, let's call him, said that with AI, they've made huge leaps forward in discovering these old typhoon attacks, and it's bringing down the time of discovery from months, years in some cases, to weeks, some cases days. So that's really good news, really, really good news. The other thing is, I think AI is going to raise the bar on secure code development. The reality is that so much of what we see in cyber just comes from, frankly, stupid defects that should have never been there in the first place. So if we can use AI to basically get us off our asses to develop more secure code, to do more secure, prioritize and do automate patching, to tell us, what are the most exploited vulnerabilities out there today in our industry, please prioritize these or do that in an automated process,
We're going to be in a much better place.
what Paul Nakasone, who until recently was the head of the NSA, said to me when I joined this federal cyber task force after I left the New York Times was, help me make it as hard for our adversaries to act here as it now is for the NSA Cyber Command to act within our adversaries, particularly China, because they have the advantage of having the Great Firewall and they don't have the privacy protections we theoretically have here. So they can't be inside everyone's stuff all the time, deflecting these attacks in real time, like they can potentially do in a place like China. So the fact that we're going to be able to use AI to essentially harden ourselves in a bigger way is great. No one really knows what's getting used inside the enterprise right now. Certainly not the security teams. And a lot of it is sort of like a wrapper on top of OpenAI. And you should think of those things as untrusted proxies that could be kind of like patient zero in a supply chain attack, like a SolarWinds attack. And I think that is really the risk that I am most concerned about.
And that actually is, if you want a nutshell version of what Lanai does, we're trying to give people visibility into exactly that, in part to help aid and augment blind spots in big security. But George, you've done a lot of investments in enterprise software and enterprise AI software, picking up where Nicole sort of left off of. All of this just makes everybody more hardcore, pay attention to InfoSec earlier, but talk about where you're seeing kind of security and your investment thesis about AI intersect, and where is it totally overlapping and where does it diverge?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with some of the things that I've been focused on from an investment standpoint, particularly on just pure AI infrastructure, and then we can talk about some of the applied use cases subsequently. So when I started as an investor about 4 years ago, a lot of my background was always kind of in data, AI, ML as a builder. I was president of Alteryx and took it public in 2017, and that was a lot of my background of just building companies, particularly when it came to a data substrate itself. So I always kind of came in at it with a mindset around data itself, right, and how to think about how to build large-scale data systems. And it turned out, in the moment that I started investing, particularly in 2020, we started to see the emergence of the modern data stack. Ended up leading the astronomer around in Airflow, did a lot of work in just open source BI tooling like Metabase. But my very, very first investment was a company called Weights and Biases, which about half the room here, if not more, should know. And it turns out that at the moment that I had invested in Weights and Biases, the experiment tracking and the parameter tuning and just how to build good models at scale was a really challenging exercise, and there weren't good tools really in the hands of machine learning practitioners at scale. And the company was very, very small at that moment when we invested, and it was my first investment at Insight back in 2020. But it turned out that the tailwinds that were available to us, because the number of machine learning practitioners grew, the number of models that were being brought into production, particularly from the foundation model builders themselves. And today, every single foundation model builder, except for Google, who has their own tools, uses weights and biases to ship their products into market. That includes NVIDIA and Meta and OpenAI and Cohere and Mistral and Anthropic. You just go down this list, and we were able to be the tooling for that entire layer. So we have companies that in the last several years have gotten to scale in the infrastructure. And that's a good sign, right? Because it basically means that we have the sedimentation on the infrastructure to now do the interesting things that layer on top. Bilal and I serve on a board for a company called Fiddler, and it turns out that we're in a moment where we can now bring machine learning models into production. We have to understand the overall monitoring, observability, and how well the model is performing, both LLM-based models as well as non-LLM-based models. And so Fiddler's certainly having a moment in the market right now, although it took a few years for Fiddler to get there. Anshu sitting here, one of our investments that we made was just in privacy preservation. And so when you start to think about what are the data sets that go into building LLMs at scale, you have to be able to preserve the privacy of the data that's going into train the model, as well as how you think about the inference at scale as you're outputting tokens. And so in that regard, I do think there's more possible on the infrastructure, but we're at that turning point where you can take all those investments from an infrastructure standpoint and build incredible applications. They haven't all emerged yet. I mean, we took an early bet in a company called Jasper, which was probably the second fastest growing software company ever. And it was a wild experience because, ChatGPT comes out and literally Jasper hits a brick wall. And we have to now figure out how to recalibrate Jasper into a more enterprise-oriented product, and today it is. It literally goes to content marketers and chief marketing officers in many organizations, Adobe and Salesforce and Google, and the chief marketing officers are now relying on the enterprise workflows that are underpinned with Jasper, which happens to have a number of LLMs and transformers underlying how that is coming to production, particularly for content marketers to build. So what I am really seeing right now in the market is this moment that we've gone past that infrastructure. We now have a lot of opportunity to build applied AI systems at scale. And that's where a lot of my time and attention is really going into this next stage of investing.
George, the way you describe it is a little bit how it feels to have been, to be at this moment in startup land, in that it feels like the internet circa 1997 a little bit. And yet the difference between then and now is that there are these huge Magic 7 companies that are developing simultaneously LLMs, infrastructure to support those LLMs. I'm curious, Nicole, your thought of, there's been a lot of discussion of, are these Magic 7 companies nation states that operate outside any sort of regulatory, citizen-led environment? How do you think of that, and how does CISA, maybe describe what CISA is, your role on CISA, and how do we think about that? Because this could either be the birth time of incredible new companies that are currently like some of the ones that George mentioned, but it could also be the time when a lot of investment went into those new companies, but there were 7 companies at the end.
It does feel like, I'm just doing my own angel investing, I have my own cyber mission fund. It does feel like, why would I invest in anything that competes with OpenAI and Anthropic right now? Like, I'm gonna go let those guys figure that out, and then there will be a new wave, and maybe I can get in there, but it's not my sweet spot. CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We love security so much, we put it twice in the name of the agency. It's 4 years old. It got famous during the 2020 election when Chris Gratz, the director, called it the most secure election in history, and Trump fired him by tweet. Before then, I don't think anyone knew it existed.
It's a federal office.
It's a federal agency under Homeland Security, but we don't like to admit that because then people associate us with TSA. I'm on their advisory board. And there's some awesome people on that advisory board. And so far, they've taken a really light hand to AI. They did an AI risk assessment this year. They basically found that most of the attacks that were seen used or are enabled by AI are just slightly better versions of existing techniques, like better written spear phishing emails, better searches for vulnerable servers, that kind of thing. We're not yet seeing the sort of nightmare scenario of developing zero-day exploits and deploying them at scale, but we haven't seen it just yet. I just really worry about the possibility of a supply chain attack that isn't necessarily enabled by OpenAI, although, by the way, OpenAI did admit that it was hacked and some of its core technology was stolen by nation-state hackers. They didn't name who. So maybe that's coming. I worry more about these wrappers, because when you just do like a LinkedIn data analysis, a lot of these wrappers are, 1-2 person teams. You have no idea who they really are, and it's pretty easy to think that they're moving fast and they're not necessarily going in and using defense in-depth strategies and making sure everything's all locked up and ready to go. And if you are a nation state and you are not working on how to make one of those a Trojan horse, you're not doing your job. So right now, it's like we're very much in this Netscape moment. And I even spent some time on it in my book, because it's essentially like, Netscape came along, Microsoft's like, okay, we just need a Netscape competitor. Like, everyone stop what you're doing and work on this as quickly as you can and forget security. And all of a sudden, all these web servers appeared on the market and they were crap, and every hacker out there could use them to get into Microsoft customers. That's kind of where we are now with AI. It's sort of like, Brad Smith, until recently, like, all he talked about was security. Now, I don't know the last time I see Brad Smith on a panel talking about security. He's just out there talking about the benefits of AI. It's sort of like, okay, let's just forget that we didn't solve any of the problems of the last generation of technology, and let's go full bore.
I would love to hear your perspective on this, George. Just back to are we going to be Magic 7 again, or is this opening a field up to kind of change the chessboard?
I think we have to keep two thoughts in the same place at the same time. And one thought is exactly what you pointed out, Lexi, because 1997, let's just kind of go back to the way back when machine. What was the most popular search engine in the world in 1997? It turns out it was Alta Vista, right? Because Google didn't exist in 1997. And so we flash forward in 07 with the wave around mobile emerging with the iPhone. Well, it turns out the killer application wasn't until Uber, started to scale out UberX and rideshare, not even the original version of Uber, right? And so that didn't happen until 2011. So I do think that there is tremendous opportunity after this initial formation of the infrastructure is in place to build just amazing companies. And that's played out every single wave before it. It's certainly played out in the wave of internet, mobile, and cloud, and I do think that's going to still be the case. But the other thought that you have to hold in your mind is that the larger incumbents in this space, as well as the new emerging providers of the foundational technology, being the LLMs themselves, are incredibly capable players, and they have a incumbency in the market that I don't think we've ever seen in any of the other previous technology waves, as far as companies having that level of incumbency. Now, I think there are certain things that are happening that are, call it keeping those, call it big tech organizations in check. One of the biggest things is like, look, right now, those organizations cannot acquire anyone, big, medium, or small. Like, I sold 3 companies to NVIDIA in January. Only 2 of them went through. One of them, Run AI, is still in process. It's been referred to the DOJ, and that's all I can say about it at that point, right? But that gives you an implication of the landscape being a lot more nuanced, right? Like, yes, this is going to be bigger than anything else we've seen before it. So startup founders can build incredible businesses. However, there are incumbents that are more capable and more sort of forward-leaning in terms of like building compelling products and bringing them to market. At the same time, I do think there's a little bit more regulation on big tech just unlike the last two waves of technology, are not necessarily going to go unfettered and just dominate, the entirety of the landscape.
Wow, I feel like I could talk to you guys for days. I'm going to ask one last question, opening it to the audience. I'm looking here, I'm looking there, I'm looking there. Somebody's going to have a question, okay? That's a softball. I'm not a cold caller right now. I will if I have to, but because you mentioned the R word, I have to talk about regulation. There's been such a flattening of the discourse about regulation and the purpose of regulation. And we don't have anybody in the Congress, really, Senate or House, that understands deeply technology, how it's built, business models. There's a lot of staff people who do. What do you feel like if you were an advisor to the next administration, whatever that was, and that administration was serious about balancing the multiple things you have to balance in regulation? How do we let innovation thrive? How do we not block innovation from happening? How do we keep the country and people secure? And this context of AI and security that you've both painted, what do you feel like is the atomic unit that should be regulated? Is it the data? Is it the people? Is it the company and rules and processes around those? Or is it something else?
I still think the worst law on the books is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It was written so poorly and it's been used so randomly against people who should never have been charged with this thing in most cases. It's basically the only real hacking law we have on the books. It's never been used appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to remind any regulator you spend time with just how crappy that law is. This administration, I personally believe, has been the best administration we've ever had on cybersecurity. They don't have any real authorities, but they have managed to do things like use the power of the purse to say, hey, if you ever want to do business with the federal government, you have to meet these NIST standards, and we'll even rip out the red tape, and you can self-certify that you meet these NIST standards. But if we catch you lying to us, which we will, because you'll get hit by a ransomware attack, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. I want to see them use that same kind of creativity with AI. I don't want to see them use the hammer. I want to hear your thoughts on the AI executive order. I thought it was perfectly reasonable to write in things like red teaming. I think that red teaming is critical. You should understand what the vulnerabilities are. That would be a sensible standard, in my opinion. Anything beyond that, all I'll say is, please don't make this like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, because it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a nightmare for innovation. And it's probably going to get used against the wrong people. And other than that, I'm really just not equipped to really speak more in a more nuanced way. But
I think on the executive order itself, look, there's a lot of controversy about the executive order, whether it was too heavy-handed, if it wasn't enough. One thing I will say is it did feel like whoever wrote it, and whether it was staffers and how it came together, at least the topics that needed to be discussed were on the table, right? And I think that was a great start. I also think that there are certain things that I was more appreciative of, like, for instance, there was a suggestion that maybe we should monitor the amount of compute, particularly that goes into training models at scale. And maybe, petaflops of compute that are going into building the next generation of models, at least we should know who's doing that work, right? And I think that's actually not a bad thing, right? Because if you think about this capability now continuing to permeate the world and certain actors having access to it, like, you can do nefarious things with much smaller models even today. I mean, look at or on GPT, right? Someone like literally imbued a generative pre-trained transformer with all of the basics of like level 1, level 2 black hat hacking, and it's out there, and it's making like bad hackers better at doing their jobs, right? Or doing the nefarious work that they're doing. And that's like already out there, right? So I do think that there's some things that are worthwhile to not put full handbrakes on the innovation, but at least be aware who's doing what, when, and where. And I think that I'm actually a little bit more agreeable about.
All right, thank you both so much. Petaflops is a unit of compute power. It's a measurement of, it's not a dirty word. I just want to, in case anybody else's head went there, that is not what it is. Okay, so let's take 3 questions from the audience. Yes, all right. Bilal.
Bilal's very here with Lux Capital. Question is, I've observed the internet for whatever 30 years now, and it was all about globalization and bringing everybody on board and having everybody access to it democratically or otherwise, giving access and opportunity to the rest of the world to participate. Even if internet was invented here, a lot of the internet companies are here, and the servers were made here, or at least in a few countries. With AI, I'm starting to feel there's a backwards trajectory on that. People are building AI models for India because how could you give your information to an AI that can be compromised by the US government? The models being built in Japan. Server side with seeing TSMC. We might go to war with China, basically over Taiwan, which most people in America still can't tell you where Taiwan is, but they're ready to go to war. How does this get played out, and what does that mean for business? Right? Because all our companies, even startups, are global businesses. Their customers are abroad. So are we rethinking the entire global economy in the context of what AI may or may not be able to do?
That's an easy, I'd say that's a layup for one of you.
So, Bilal, I think, I don't know if you and I ever talked about this, but look, we're in a state of deglobalization. And I know as much as we'd like to not think that, right, for what the last 30 years of globalization, I would say the last sort of half a decade plus, if not longer, decade is a period of deglobalization. And
which is nationalization or regionalization or whatever?
In the context of AI, look, Jensen's the first one going out there saying, we need sovereign AI systems, right? And by the way, there are people all around the world that are absolutely buying into that value proposition. So I don't think we're going to be in a moment where you're not going to see the Sakura model out of Japan, right? Or the Falcon models out of the Middle East, or the Mistral models out of Europe. I do think that Pandora has left the box because it is in the sort of tailwind of the deglobalization that's basically happening. Now, what does that then mean for folks that are trying to build global businesses at scale? I think it just means that, look, there's a part of being global that is honestly just going to be more provincial than we've ever had to be, at least in the last sort of 20, 30 years that you and I grew up in this business, right? And that's just the reality of, the geopolitical landscape that we're in, right? So I had a chance to brief the CIA about a year and a half ago on the topic of like LLMs and how they were emerging at scale. And at that moment in time, like the biggest question, and this was a declassified conversation, so I can actually talk about this. So at the moment in time, the biggest question in the room was, why weren't the Chinese models as good as what was coming out in the US? And it actually turns out there was one discrete answer. It was RLHF. It turns out that there was no feedback loops in the Chinese models because it was an autocratic state, right? And there was no way to get a feedback loop going into a model with, human feedback. And that was really what drove the emergence of the GPT-4 style model from 3.5, right? It was an RLHF loop. And so I think everyone's going to have to figure this out, but we're still going to be figuring it out in a moment of, for better or for worse, deglobalization. And that largely means we're going to have to live with sovereign AI systems for the foreseeable future.
Nicole, if you want to add to that, you can, but I was going to go to another question just to popcorn around. Do you
Oh,
have?
no, I mean, all I have is an anecdote. I mean, yes, we're in a period, I call it balkanization.
That's right.
Same.
Yeah, and, we heard these calls after Snowden, we want all our data to stay in Brazil, we want all our data to stay in X. It's like, okay, good luck with that. Like, actually, that just makes it easier for the NSA to hack you if it's just
Right.
sitting in a foreign country. But it's interesting, my good friend Nate Vick, who's our very first cyber ambassador, happened to be there for the first diplomatic engagement after the Chinese spy balloons were discovered floating over Montana. Remember, Blinken had canceled a meeting. Well, somehow they didn't cancel this one meeting, and Nate was sitting next to his counterpart from China and the Philippines at this other meeting. And the guy is telling him, like, we're beating you on this, we're beating you on AI, we're beating you on that. It's like, well, China's not beating us on AI anymore. I don't know what basis their workers claims. And it's because of exactly what George just said. And so actually, I think in some ways, it's going to be the most open democratic societies that see the most momentum around what we're seeing right now. And it's going to be the societies that are quasi-authoritarian or authoritarian that are going to hamstring themselves. So, we'll see what happens. But it's interesting to see how it'll play out.
Yeah. Yeah, great question, Bilal. Okay, out over here. Anybody?
In the back.
Oh, okay. And I'm going to go to the back, and then you'll be the third. Okay, do you want to shout it out, and I can...
I can try. My name's Alex. I'm here for the networking event. It's super cool so far. My question is I heard about this theory called the dark forest theory, where the internet and social media sort of become so filled with AI people and sort of AI personas that there's just not as much of an appeal to go there. So I'm curious, what do you all think about that?
I think we think we're in it. No. So the question was dark forest theory, which says the internet will be filled with deep fakes and AI that you can't trust. And so people will go, I guess, analog. I don't know.
Yeah. So I haven't honestly heard about the dark forest theory, but there is a corollary to it that's actually really impactful for this next generation of models that are being built. And it turns out that when you look at the GPT-4 model that emerged, it was basically trained on 20% of the publicly available corpus, right? And so it turns out that 20% of the publicly available corpus was needed to train a 1 trillion parameter large language model, right? But as the amount of generated data, particularly in the last several years, has really played out in the last 2 years, guess what? It's about 40% of all the publicly available content on the web is generated now, right? And so it turns out if you need to go build, let's just say, a 10 trillion parameter model or potentially a 50 trillion parameter model, there wasn't enough publicly available data before, and even worse, all the new generated data is generative, right? It's built by the machines themselves. And so we have a problem, right? Because you're not going to likely end up with a high quality model if you have this Ouroboros, the snake is eating itself. And so I don't know about the dark forest theory, but I do know we're going to have a really tough time training this next generation of LLM at scale, particularly as you get into something that's maybe 10x, perhaps even 100x more impressive than GPT-4.
Just on deepfakes, one of the investments I made this year that I'm most proud of is a company called Get Real that just came out of stealth. And it just does real-time deepfake detection. And it's started by a guy, Hani Farid at Berkeley. And he's sort of the world's biggest expert in, I think, what he calls synthetic media. But you can use it on video, you can use it on calls. I'm really excited. I'm going to go out to John Deere next week and see how John Deere's using it. Because their executives are getting spoofed in all sorts of ways. And they just wanted something where when they're doing a Zoom call, they can verify that the person on the other end of the Zoom call is a real person. But I'm really excited about the introductions I'm making for them for the New York Times Video Investigations Unit. Because it's all of a sudden, as a reporter, what is real? What can you trust anymore? And even just seeing presentations on what the deepfake threat looks like this year versus last year is horrifying. Then to think about where it's going to be next year or 5 years from now. I mean, the one I keep calling out is there was this situation in London this year where they had a deepfake of the mayor, who's Muslim, saying that they were canceling, I think it was Holocaust Remembrance Day. And
Crazy.
suddenly there's protests everywhere and they have no idea what it's even about. And finally, by the time they figure it out, however many days or hours later, they're saying, this isn't real. But by that point, everyone's worked up and they're like, we don't care. We're still pissed. We're going to protest harder. And so I think we're going to need something that is looking at, how these files are packaged and looking at various heuristics like shadow forensics and all the things that feed into their model to say, this is, likely a deep fake or this is likely real. And that's pretty terrifying. But I think that if we don't do that, the hell that will happen. First thing I'm going to Google when I leave is the dark horse theory, because I think that is very realistic.
Dark force.
Dark
force.
One quick add to the deepfakes piece. So it turns out that with the generative models, particularly for voice that are available today, you only need 3 seconds of our current voices to be able to fully synthetically generate a full corpus of what we'd want to say to, I don't know, say for instance, an IVR system. Like every IVR system in the world is busted at this point, right? Like you've had to now upgrade because of exactly this issue. So, I do think that there's more challenging moments, particularly from a cyber standpoint, coming that we're really prepared for, particularly at this present moment.
I cannot thank both of you enough. You were even better than I thought. This chemistry was magic. No, I knew you were going to be good. We went to some low spaces together, and not leaving feeling totally on top, and yet then you took it higher. So thank you. I think what is so amazing about this moment, I feel like if I were to sort of pick up on a couple themes here, is we've had since 1997 to see how when introducing major changes, thank you, the internet, cloud, mobile, we have had some reps at how humans and machines advancing together fares. When you don't have people looking at this clearly, knowing the risks, flattening of the discourse of, I'm a tech optimist. What is the opposite? Of course, just be practical. Whatever technology you build has the consequence you built it for, and usually another consequence on people, on planet, on democracy. And all we're asking, I think, as people who came and were conscious enough to come to a talk like this, is be conscious. Be conscious. Harden your own security edges so your tool, as Lanai is thinking of organizing enterprise Gen AI information and make it visible, accessible, and actionable, we're holding ourselves to such a high security standard that I don't even remember holding ourselves to at Google back in the day. So we can all do our part to help support a space and place in the future where everyone really is empowered to use this technology to do something amazing, discover the next drug, come up with the next type of transportation. And I hope that tonight was as illuminating for all of you as it was for me, and that you'll stay and be part of the conversation. And if you are at all interested in making the conversation your life, at Lanai, come talk to me or anyone on the team. Again, team, raise your hand. We are wearing various shades of orange. Again, Mohit, we don't shame him for either being colorblind or just being a rebel who doesn't follow instructions. All are welcome here. So thank you all. I would love to get a picture because this is our nice first night in our new space. So I would love for everybody to come up here
Amazing.
and get one picture
Yeah.
if you're open to it. Thank you guys. Give it up for our speakers.